Well, so I would talk about a topic that I understand is a little bit further away from what you hear normally about, but I think it's something that should interest every citizen and every scientist. I want to talk about a solution to climate change, which is a tremendous challenge. And I'm not claiming that what I present here is very easy or very likely to become reality, but we have to think hard about what might be possible. And it has to be informed by what we know already about good policy. So I'll build on different fields, climate studies, environmental economics in particular. So just to give you an idea about the challenge that we face, this comes from 2009, it's maybe not 100% accurate, but it gives a good idea how much we have to reduce the carbon intensity of our output. So what you see to the left, 2007 world, is like 3/4 of a kilogram CO2 we emit for each dollar that we produce worldwide. To the right, you see that in the UK and Japan it's a bit better. We have a lower carbon intensity. Of course, for countries that are not shown here, China, for instance, it will be much higher, or Russia, or the Ukraine. If you go then to the right 4 columns, you see what in the future we might want to reach, depending on how many people there will be in the world in the future, and how high will be their average income and their consumption, which is of course a measure of CO2 emissions. And then you see that under a favorite scenario, we have to reduce with a factor 20. That means 95% reduction of the carbon intensity. Under a less favorable scenario, we have to reduce with more than a factor 100. That means 99% reduction of carbon intensity. That's shocking. Many NGOs use some of these numbers and they will say 80, 90%. So there's a lot of debate. But let's say it's at least 80%. That's already shockingly ambitious. So this is where we have to go. So what would be an easy solution? Well, to go very quickly to renewable energy. To make sure that all our energy is low carbon. Not zero carbon maybe, but low carbon. That's difficult. It's difficult because before we can get to 100% renewables, we would have to invest so much energy in building up that infrastructure that we would emit already a lot of CO2 before we could reach that. And indeed, maybe 20% of the future carbon budget will be needed to build up this infrastructure in the coming decades. But there are many other problems with renewables, and I'm not going into all the details here, but it's clear that we need a lot of energy and also labor inputs, because these are sources that are less concentrated, so they require more investment than traditional sources. If you go beyond 1/3 of total electricity provided by renewables, then you need considerable energy storage, because there are cycles, there are night and day cycles and seasonal cycles. In wintertime, when there's less solar energy, you typically need more heating. So there's no match between the amount of energy you will get from renewables and what you typically need to satisfy demand. Then we haven't thought really about recycling of equipment. Now if you finish your solar PV equipment, you put it with general waste. But if we do put solar PV on every other roof, then we will have such a tremendous recycling problem that we need serious investment in that, and that will require a lot of energy also, because recycling materials like solar PV is not so easy. They're complicated at the level of molecules, molecular structure, and so it requires serious energy input. That's also not yet calculated. So what people often present as the net benefits are often not really the overall benefits over the whole life cycle. And then there is a problem that capacity is often unused. So if you see figures how much we have, then how much capacity we have, then that doesn't say how much we will really produce. And you see that capacity of renewables, solar and wind, here summarized, is much lower than for traditional sources of electricity, nuclear, fossil fuels. So we won't achieve a renewable future quickly. We will have to reduce CO2 emissions among many other types of activities. This is a figure that shows also what happens if you go to a so-called low EROI energy source, as renewables are. EROI stands for energy return on investment. And whereas now you need to invest a little bit of energy to get a lot of gross energy and then net energy back, if we go to low concentrated energy sources, then we will have to invest much more. And that will go at the cost of what we can spend in consumption on what we call here non-essentials, the best things in life, where we enjoy life. Maybe we can still fulfill very basic needs, but our societies are far beyond that. And we have had a lot of economic growth where we now consume a lot of stuff that's not really needed, but it makes life enjoyable, and maybe in the future might be more difficult. And that creates a problem. That's not an easy change. That doesn't make people enthusiastic. So am I pessimistic after this? A little bit, but I also think that the economy has tremendous flexibility to change. We just have to activate the many possible changes that are possible in the economy. Different input mix. CLAM is often mentioned. That means capital, labor, energy, materials. Shift away from certain types of energy. Substitution in energy, naturally, but also maybe use more labor. Change the sector structure and the composition. Along with that, change demand composition and maybe the level of demand. Alter technologies of energy generation, of energy used and transformation. And also think to change electricity production and transport. So there's a lot that could change, but we don't have the policies in place to stimulate those changes. And I'm quite confident that if we would do that, if we had a benevolent dictator that would immediately implement the right policies, we would see the changes come so quickly. So it's largely a political problem that we have to solve. But it's not only that, because there's also still not agreement on what would be the best policies and the composition of policies. So that's what I want to clarify. It's important to understand that we're not going to solve this easily with voluntary, individual or unilateral national action. We're talking about a global problem. It's a problem characterized by free riding. So many countries want to do a lot, they say, but at the end of the day they cannot do a lot because it's a big sacrifice to do a lot. They can harm their consumption opportunities, they can harm their competitive position, and the contribution to the global problem is very little. Even a country like China, emitting about 30% of CO2 emissions, could do a lot to reduce, but it would have so many costs to do that it's not eager to do that. So it's a free riding problem. All the countries want to do something, but they really are not motivated to do it. And so we need to also get beyond that free rider behavior. Don't think it's only technological innovation. Some people say, no, we can solve it easily. It's just a matter of innovation. Well, first of all, innovation takes a long time. Second, innovation needs to be steered. If you don't have right policies, then innovation will not go quickly enough and it will not go in the right direction. So it's not like we have to choose between strict policies and innovation. No, the strict policies are necessary to make the innovation go in the right direction quickly enough. Economic studies show that the major part of greenhouse gas emissions, so that's the broader category, it's not only CO2, it's other greenhouse gases like methane, that the reduction of those until 2050 has to occur to a large extent through structural and behavioral changes in demand and supply, and to a smaller extent through innovations or adoption of new technologies. That doesn't mean that in the longer run, important innovations that are now started already are important, but we also need to benefit from changes that have less to do with innovation. So, if we talk about policies, well, how should we design policies for a transition to a low carbon economy? Well, it's important to take a systemic perspective, to know for sure that your policies are not just well intended, but that they don't Test? Yeah, it works? Okay, great.
Can you talk a bit closer to the screen?
Okay, you want to see me? Okay. Good. Yeah, it's a pity there's no monitor here, because I have to look back. First lesson, giving a lecture, don't look back at the screen. But yeah, you need a monitor for that. Okay, so carbon leakage is a serious problem, and carbon leakage might get worse if the difference between policies gets bigger. So this is one concern. Second concern is the green paradox, which means basically that oil markets and other fossil fuel markets will respond to climate policy. So if the Arabic oil states realize that climate policies are going to be implemented that will reduce the demand for their fossil fuels, then they will plan for that, and they will try to get rid of these fossil fuels, because in the future they will be unsaleable, they will not be worth so much, so they will drop the prices, and that will stimulate demand. So they compensate somehow for policies that are now implemented. And especially if you would have subsidies for renewables, then at the moment that these subsidies make renewables competitive with fossil fuels, then the fossil fuel markets will just drop the prices. And then these subsidies become ineffective. Third problem is a rebound, energy or carbon rebound, which means that all kinds of strategies that initially in a first stage reduce energy use may later on increase energy use. For instance, you could voluntarily put on a sweater in wintertime and lower your heating system, reduce also energy and energy use, and at the same time save money. That money will appear on your budget, and maybe at some time you make a trip to Barcelona for a weekend, and you still may tell all your friends and family we're saving money, which is not necessarily true. If you buy a more efficient car, a more energy efficient car, and you're well aware of that, you may make more trips, more frequent trips, longer trips, and in that way compensate for the higher energy efficiency, which then leads to less energy savings, net energy savings. There's also psychological spillovers. When people do something good in one area, they feel sometimes morally supported to do something bad in another area. So you don't eat meat, but you fly. Or you don't fly, but you have a nice car. And if you don't do a lot of things that generate energy, you still save money. So that money is an incentive for you to spend on things. And the things that we like to spend on usually are energy intensive. Those are the fun things in life. The only way to avoid that is to lower your income voluntarily, but few people do that and can be expected to do that. And finally, you have environmental problem shifting. And you could say we plant more we go in the direction of biofuels to avoid CO2 emissions. But that, if you do that at a large scale, may have a lot of problems: poverty, fertilizer, pesticide use, biodiversity effects, and that can be seen as shifting problems from climate change to other areas. So, what is the most important setting for policy at the moment, for climate policy? Well, that's the Paris Agreement. And how does the Paris Agreement score on these escape routes? If you take this systemic perspective, how would you evaluate the Paris Agreement? Well, in a summary, the agreement provides no insurance against these escape routes. That's partly because it's not a real agreement. The Paris Agreement doesn't bind countries to the same policies. It is more a set of voluntary offers, voluntary pledges, nationally determined contributions, with a technical term that's being used in the United Nations documents, NDCs. The hope of the Paris Agreement is to limit the increasing global mean surface temperature to 2 or even 1.5 degrees warming. But studies have calculated that we should count on 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius warming with the Paris Agreement. But this overlooks the escape routes. It might get worse. If these escape routes are active, we might get out higher than 3 degrees. Now, to understand the Paris Agreement, we should see that there are different types of NDCs, pledges by countries. So some countries have promises that are very clear. They say we will reduce emissions in 2030 versus a base year. It could be 2014, 15, 16. There is variety there, which is confusing if you want to compare. But they say clearly how much they're going to reduce their emissions versus the base year. Another set of countries has a completely different approach. They say our emissions are going to increase if we don't have any policy, but if we have policy, we will lower the rate of increase. So that's the gain. And they can present this as a reduction, but it's a reduction versus a scenario of increasing emissions. And then there's a third category where India and China are especially dominating, where the promise is to reduce the carbon content of output of each dollar produced. But depending on how much GDP grows, you never know how much net emissions will result. So that's a bit of a vague promise. And then there are countries that have more projects like renewable energy investments without saying exactly how much they want to reduce emissions. And what I did with one of my PhD students is harmonize all these, uniformize all these pledges and make them comparable. And we all reduce them, recalculate them to category 1. So category 2 is here, calculated as if category 1, and the same for categories 3 and 4. And what you see here, first of all, is that there's a lot of diversity. The range is, for instance here, the range is much wider than here. Also here the range is very wide, India, China. And what you also see is that many countries in categories 2 and 3 and 4 are above the horizontal line, which means that emissions are growing by 2030. So most countries here show growth. And that's not what we want, of course, but this is inevitable. A lot of countries are developing, so it's understandable. And countries like China, which are so big, are going to contribute a lot to that growth in share terms. So the fact that it's still positive is bad news in a way. And what you see also is that in this category are countries with what you can see at the horizontal axis with high carbon intensity, and they're still growing. You see, they're still growing. So you see that there's a lot of diversity, and the conclusion in terms of the systemic effect is that there are generally there will be weak policies, and that will stimulate rebound. And there will be very distinct policies between different parts of the world, and that will stimulate trade effects and industry relocation, so carbon leakage. And that might lead to a surface temperature that may go perhaps be above 3.5 degrees and maybe far beyond 3.5 degrees. My prediction is that many developing countries, which have promises in categories 2 and 3 and partly 4, but mainly here, they maybe don't have ambitious promises, but it might still be difficult for them to stick to those promises. Because what is going to happen is that a lot of energy intensive activity is going to move their way. And for them it will be very difficult to resist that, because that contributes to development in these countries. So that's one of my fears, that will happen as a result of the Paris Agreement. So how can we get to something that's better than the Paris Agreement? Because that's really needed. We need something that binds countries in terms of policies. The Paris Agreement it takes the form of voluntary pledges. Countries promise how much they're going to reduce their emissions. But what we need is a policy harmonization agreement, where countries say we use the same policies and we use them at the same stringency level. Then there will not be differences between countries, and there will not be trade effects, and there will be little to no carbon leakage. So we need a harmonized or a uniform approach. We can really bet on it that unilateral policies are bound to remain weak. First of all, many countries want now, with the Paris Agreement ratified, they want to implement policies, but they find it difficult. In many countries there's discussions, there's resistance from the population also, but there's as yet very little implemented worldwide that is consistent with the promises. And why is that? Because in many countries there is the fear that competitiveness of the country's production, its export position, will be harmed. And this is an understandable fear. And even if it's not true, or it's not something to worry about so much, politicians worry about it. So we need an approach that avoids that. That won't happen with unilateral policies. That happens if you can harmonize these policies. The second step then is to make sure that we negotiate in a way that allows that. So we have to negotiate in the post-Paris meetings, the COP meetings of the United Nations, using an approach that limits free riding and that focuses on a very concrete instrument. That instrument could be a standard, it could be a subsidy, it could be a tax. I'm going to talk about what might be a good instrument. But the problem with the quota, as in the Paris Agreement, is that they stimulate free riding. Because if you have a quota, you don't know what the other countries are going to do. You're never going to be very ambitious with that. So, and finally, we need a transition process. We're never going to get to the necessary global policy in one step. So we need to think in phases. What are realistic phases to go through from a feasible start to an ambitious end? And my proposal is that we need to consider multiple levels, coalitions of countries, the United Nations, FCCC is a difficult term, it means the United Nations Framework, Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in that context, the COP meetings are held where Paris was negotiated and where Paris improvements will be negotiated. And I will say, for instance, also something about the USA. The USA is potentially an important player, but not willing to participate. But it represents a lot of emissions, so how can we get the USA into the picture? Well, first of all, which instrument? There are many specific approaches. I was discussing with one of my PhD students and he was triggering me like, yeah, but that instrument should be in it. But I think you can defend that these are 4 important categories of instruments next to these quota which the Paris Agreement worked on. So some form of pricing carbon, which is the source of the evil, let's say. Carbon burned leads to CO2. Technical standards, so standards on technology performance in terms of emissions. Subsidies for adoption of technologies that are low carbon. And information provision along with so-called nudges. Nudges means changes in the physical environment, in the social environment to stimulate that people make low carbon choices. Yeah? Now, traditionally, in policy analysis, these 3 criteria are mentioned. Effectiveness of emissions reduction, do you really reduce your emissions and how much? Distributional equity and the cost of emissions avoided. If the cost is low, then it's not so bad for our economy and will so maybe negative employment effects. I would add one criterion here, potential for global upscaling, because that's very important. If we cannot globally upscale the policy, then it won't work, because then we will always stay in the unilateral sphere of policies, and that's not going to solve climate. So with colors, I try to indicate which instruments are scoring relatively well. So then we have green, then we have light, light red, dark red and very dark red, or pink. I could say light pink, medium pink and red. I could have put this also green. Maybe I will do that in the future, because maybe it's a bit too biased, is that only here is green and only here is green. But what I want to say is that carbon pricing scores well on all these 4 criteria. And especially with the distributional equity, maybe some comment is necessary, and I will come to that in a moment. There are ways to design carbon pricing so that distributional equity, poor people, are not harmed too badly. Information provision scores also well on some of these criteria, but it's not performing very well in terms of effectiveness. Studies show that with information provision you can get maybe at most 10% emissions reduction. But providing more and more information won't necessarily make people reduce emissions more. Whereas with a carbon price, you can increase the carbon price, and at a certain point it will become very unattractive for people to use coal or gas or fossil fuel-based electricity. With technical standards, there are also all kinds of complications. Technical standards don't stimulate people to use machines less. For instance, a car could have a nice performance, but that nice performance will make people often use it more rather than less. That's the rebound effect. Whereas if you have a carbon price, then people will use the car less, because each time they use the car, the gasoline is more expensive. Yeah? So the technical standard will affect the purchase behavior of people, but not the use behavior. And you want to affect both. A carbon price means that people also are affected in the purchase behavior. If the carbon price is very high, then people want an energy efficient engine because they know that the alternative will be very costly in the use phase. But moreover, they will use the car moderately because each use has a price target. Yeah? Well, I could speak more about this, but I guess the main point is clear. So carbon pricing is something that we need to look seriously at. And economists have written a lot about it, and they have classical arguments for it. I would say these 4 arguments are most mentioned. They change relative prices of high and low carbon goods and services. And that means that people, when they have the alternatives, low carbon alternative, high carbon alternative, they will be triggered to go to the low carbon alternative. They can deal with heterogeneous polluters. That sounds a bit difficult, but you have to realize that the reduction of CO2 emissions has many different options and associated costs in very different sectors. So for instance, you could say CO2 emissions come from agriculture, from transport, from industry, from services, from households. But a ton emissions reduction in all the different sectors at the margin has a different cost. It might be much cheaper in one sector than in another. And for society, it would be better to focus on cheap reduction options, because climate change solutions are already so difficult. If you make it very expensive, it won't be easier. So a carbon price selects for that. And this graph shows that by showing 2 marginal abatement cost curves. And you could have here a total goal of emissions reduction, Z asterisk, and then divided equally among the polluters, and then you are on this line. But then you see that the marginal costs are different. And it would be better to sit here, to sit on this line, where the marginal costs are equal, but the emission reductions ZA asterisk and ZB asterisk are different. They are heterogeneous. You see that typically, in this case, the polluter B with a lower abatement cost curve will reduce pollution more. Yeah? And you still arrive at the same total emissions reduction. Now the problem is, if you're going to ask those firms about their abatement cost curves, they will never inform you about that. They will not know it exactly, consciously, or they will lie about it. They will always try to inflate the cost, say, no, it's very expensive to reduce our emissions. So it's very difficult to get information directly from those firms to determine ZA and ZB. But what you can do is charge a price. And firms will sit around this point. If they're reasonably rational, they will sit around this point, because they will make the trade-off between either polluting and paying a tax for it, or abating and paying a cost for it. And at the margin for them, it's optimal to make those costs equal, because otherwise there would be a gain to pollute more or less. So they will always sit at this equilibrium between, this is the tax, at this equilibrium between the tax and their abatement cost curve. So this is the technical way. This is one of the most important graphs of my field, environmental economics, I would say. Really. It seems very simple, but it's not trivial. Someone had a bright idea one day, you know, and it's an important idea. And of course, this is important because if you see the discussion at many national levels about how to do CO2 emissions reduction, there's often the idea that all the sectors should contribute equally or proportionally. Agriculture 20% of the country, or 10%, then it has to contribute 10%. But it should not work like that. That's wrong thinking. That's wrong thinking. Of course, it's important to have a cheap, a cost-effective solution, because that contributes to political acceptability. So pricing, I explained that also now in this example, means decentralization of regulation. You don't need information about the pollution and the technologies to reduce the pollution. It's a decentralized solution. Just one instrument, one tax can make sure that all the polluters reduce their emissions to an equal marginal abatement cost. And therefore, together, they find the cheapest solution for society. And that's fantastic. And then there's also a permanent incentive, because firms pay for pollution, not abate it, and as a result they always have an incentive to get rid of that payment. Firms don't like to pay taxes, that's a cost, so they will do anything to get rid of that cost. So they will make the choice, is it worthwhile to adopt a new technology even though it requires an investment? Can I then get rid of those taxes, is it worthwhile? So there is an incentive to adoption, and as a derivation of that, there's an incentive for innovation also, by those same firms or by other firms. And importantly, if there's no price on carbon, then innovation trajectories will not be guided well. They will go too slow or in the wrong direction, because innovators look a lot at price opportunities also. Innovation in companies is very much driven also by what are the prices, what are the expectations about prices. So this is the classical story, but I think there are many more arguments for carbon pricing, and I don't have the time to go in all the details, but I can list them at least. Complete control, I have a graph, I'll say that. What is important, that many emissions arise from market decisions. In market, prices and costs are important, so we have to intervene in markets. Some people in other social science disciplines say that markets are the problems. We should get rid of markets or I don't know what. No, the markets are there to stay, don't worry. We have to intervene in those markets. Price correction is logical. Some people think we should put labels on products, eco-labels, and then calculate how much carbon emissions are behind that product in the life cycle, in the production cycle. First of all, that's a huge amount of work. There's a lot of uncertainty about it. And do we really believe that so many people read those labels and are driven by those? No, I think prices work better. Of course, if we would go in that direction, at ICTA we would be happy because there would be a lot of work for us. And life cycle analysis would grow tremendously. I also believe that firms do their financial accounting well, so prices work perfectly, carbon prices work perfectly in financial accounting of firms, and we have everything ready already to implement it. Pricing generates revenues for correcting undesirable distribution effects, and that's necessary for political support. I will say a little bit more of that in the next slide. Pricing is seen as politically difficult, but I will also show later that international policy coordination is the easiest with pricing, easier than with other instruments. Just to give one example, if you think of standards, technical standards, there's also a lot of support for harmonizing technical standards internationally. But look, for instance, at an important type of standard for cars, car emission, fuel efficiency, there are standards for that. But countries that have an important car industry will not support that very much. Germany, a relatively green country, is not going to support very strict car standards because they have car brands that tend to have large engines and a lot of fuel consumption. So they will be very resistant. Countries that don't have a car industry might be in favor. If you look at other technologies, then the distribution of countries will be different. Again, some countries will have a big interest in that and others less. So it's very difficult to get support for stringent standards across the whole set of important technologies across all countries. A carbon tax guarantees a minimal oil price, and that also makes this green paradox effect smaller. It means that, okay, maybe there is an effect of oil markets, but if the carbon price is stable, then that will compensate for that. What's also interesting is that if we have a carbon tax, then we shift revenues from the OPEC to oil importing countries, because the margin for OPEC countries, and for the oil exporters, is getting smaller. So part of their excessive profits, which funds oil sheikhs, and they put that money in football clubs again, and that's why Barcelona can pay so high salaries. That's to a large extent oil money. Manchester City, that's oil money. These are owned or sponsored by a lot of oil money. So that's how oil connects to excessive salaries in one sector. But we could keep that money in our societies. And pricing, of course, also optimizes and spreads efforts. With a carbon price, any product in the whole economy will be corrected. So millions of decisions every day will be corrected. And they all have to be corrected a little, and that's already will add up to significant emissions reduction. So it's a smooth and, in my view, the least painful transition we can imagine. I think if you use other instruments, we will not have that smoothness. I see it sometimes as a balloon, where you blow air and the balloon has holes. And with a carbon price, you close those holes nicely. With the other instruments, you close some holes, but you leave some holes open. If you have technical standards, you don't close all the holes. because there are technologies that you don't cover. There are so many technologies. We won't cover them all with a technical standard for carbon emissions. So you blow air in it and it will go out. It will be less effective. Well, here you see a scheme that says how a carbon price would go through the economy, through fossil fuels first, then through electricity production, transport, which affects trade. Electricity affects uses of electricity in production activities and in consumption. Heating will be affected. So nothing escapes the influence of a carbon price. And what also will happen is that not only big emitters, but also many small emitters, firms and households, everybody will be controlled by the carbon price. Electricity production, renewable energy will be stimulated. And what you can also expect, and that's something that in a project with a PhD student we study in my institute, that there will be a social multiplier effect. If through the carbon price many people change their behavior, social norms will also change. Low carbon will become a new norm, and then it may go faster. So it's not that it's only that effect of the carbon price, the direct effect. There will be longer term effects through social networks, through social interactions that ultimately can lead to so-called lifestyle changes. Important to stress, a carbon price is not an energy tax or a fuel tax. These are all different terms. I'm saying that because I once had a student who defended a master thesis on the carbon tax, and she got a question about that and she couldn't answer it. So imagine she wrote a master thesis on it and she was not clear on what's the difference between a fuel tax or an energy tax and a carbon tax. Now, a fuel tax can be just a decision. You have a tax, it could be proportional tax, it could be an absolute tax on a certain fuel that is unrelated to carbon content. A carbon tax effectively puts a little price on each molecule or each atom of carbon in the fuel that is going to be used for combustion purposes, which leads to CO2. And if you now see what is the carbon content of different fuels, then you can see that that matters. So natural gas is low, oil shales and tar sands are the worst, coal is second, and oil is a bit in the middle. So if you have a carbon tax, or a carbon price more generally, you could also do it with a market, then you see that you will price these fuels differently, yeah? In proportion to their CO2 content. So the incentive for using those fuels will be perfect. People will directly feel the effect of it. Of course, people often ask, and what is then the effect on the prices? That's difficult to say, because for coal, I know by heart that if you have a carbon price of $100 per ton of CO2, the price of coal in many areas will go up with a factor 4 to 6. Factor 4 to 6, 600%, that's a lot. Depends, of course, because coal prices are not the same everywhere around the world. But if you talk about oil, for instance, gasoline, it's more difficult. If you take the US, the prices would go up much more proportionally than in Europe, because in Europe we have already a lot of gasoline taxes. So it depends, and it's difficult to generalize. Yeah? There's a lot of diversity between countries. One of my concerns is that I see that there's quite a lot of resistance to carbon pricing in social sciences. I mean, you find a lot of people who are not economists who can support a carbon price, but you also find a lot of people who are indifferent about it, disinterested, or even explicitly against it for some reason. Often that has to do with issues like equity. Many people think a carbon price is inequitable and allows people to pay for pollution, and the rich can always pollute. These kinds of arguments are being there. So it's interesting to have communication with people from these areas, I think, because it's important to get broad support in science for policies that we want to recommend to governments. If social scientists are divided, that's not handy, because politicians will say, is it really true what some social scientists, notably economists, say? Others are a bit critical of it. What you see from those other disciplines, especially sociology and more critical geographers, is that they have a lot of belief in voluntarism, bottom-up processes, often organized at the community level. They believe that communities can self-organize and a lot can happen. The role of cities is also much stressed nowadays. But I must say that I don't see a so-called sufficiency proof. I have not seen yet that will solve the problem ultimately, that's a route that brings us to a definite solution. That doesn't mean that I'm against it, but I think people in those areas should also be more critical on effectiveness of solutions. Okay. So one thing that is often said about carbon pricing, that it's inequitable. That's true if you take the pure carbon price, a pure carbon tax would mean that some basic products would become expensive and people with low incomes would have trouble buying them. But if you think of carbon pricing in a wider design sphere, like carbon pricing generates revenues and these revenues can be used to redistribute, then suddenly you have a very flexible instrument. And in fact, in my research group, we're investigating how different redistribution designs lead to different outcomes in terms of effectiveness and social political support. So suddenly, carbon pricing is not doing so badly. Interestingly, when people talk about subsidies, for instance, subsidies to stimulate the use of electric cars or to stimulate that people install PV panels, solar electricity on their roof, people never talk about inequity. But these subsidies always go to people with higher incomes, not to low income households. So, what is more in that case, the matter is that these subsidies don't generate revenues that you can use to compensate the inequity. So in that sense, carbon pricing is a more powerful instrument. And it's also important to realize that revenue recycling, as it's sometimes called, for equity, can be applied at the national level, but also at the international level. And that's important too. For instance, in the Paris Agreement, there was a lot of discussion of compensating poor countries by rich countries, but the money is still not there. And there is the idea that there should be a climate fund and there should be investments by the rich countries in that, but that's difficult because it has to come out of the general budget. Well, if you have a carbon tax, then you could assign those revenues automatically to that fund. So then politically you would make it also independent from short-term concerns of politicians. So that could be also a solution to meet this goal of the Paris Agreement. I want to stress that I don't think carbon pricing is the only solution. Definitely not. We need other instruments. Other instruments do complementary things. It is clear that, and it's also clear that if you have only carbon pricing, then, for instance, among technologies, you will have a lock-in in technologies that are now performing well and profitable, but technologies that need more innovation, they are ruled out. So you need to stimulate these technologies with innovation subsidies to keep certain options open. That's absolutely important. So part of the revenues of carbon pricing could also be used for supporting innovation subsidies. And then there are also other emission sources like land conversion, deforestation, landfills. They may not work very well with carbon pricing. So other policies may be useful there. Nudges, I absolutely believe a lot in nudges, but we know little about it. But I think people are very boundedly rational and they're very triggered by how information comes to them. So the first option, biases people's decisions. So if you build a house, an architect should immediately talk about low energy alternatives. And if they don't do that, then you are already biased to go in the wrong direction. Same with car. Maybe we should make obligatory that in car sales you first try to promote low carbon alternatives. So information provision is important as well. And I'm also certainly in favor of technical standards. But I would go further than that. I would say we should limit car power simply, not fuel efficiency, because then you start having different fuel efficiency standards for different categories of cars. That's what actually happened. No, we should limit car power and we should limit speed and even acceleration. We should make cars actually less attractive, more functional, less attractive. But I know this is a far cry from reality, of course. Okay, I'm going back now to this global upscaling of carbon pricing. We have a good starting point because in the world there are a lot of initiatives already for implementing carbon pricing. So according to the World Bank, where this carbon pricing dashboard comes from, there are more than 50 regions, countries and regions and sub-country states that have implemented some form of carbon pricing, a carbon tax or a carbon market. A carbon market means emissions trading or permit trading. Now I must say that if I look at some of these, I don't think they're really carbon pricing in the correct sense, because the correct carbon pricing means you put a carbon price on all your fossil fuels, and as a result the whole economy will be affected in a consistent way by the carbon price. And that's not what happened in most of those applications. So they're not all well implemented, but it has partly to do also with the fact that they are done unilateral. So if you would like to put a carbon price, then you would have to put the carbon price on the fossil fuels when they get taken out of the ground or when you import them. And you can see already the problem when you import them. If you start putting a price on imported oil, then you also start to affect trade relationships. So many of the carbon taxes are not perfect carbon taxes, or same for the markets. So in order to go to a global uniform policy, a proposal would be, and this is not my idea, this comes from the late Martin Weitzman, a Harvard professor, is to negotiate a carbon price. And this has never been tried, and many people say it's not possible. Our proposal would be experiment with it at a COP meeting. Just experiment it, do it as a game, do it once, try it and see what you get out of it. Because you can see theoretically that it's a simpler approach. For instance, the Paris Agreement was a negotiation about almost 200 different quota, because there are 200 countries with unique quota. But if you have a negotiation for a singular, uniform carbon price, that's a one-dimensional problem. So it's simpler in that respect. Moreover, the free rider behavior is discouraged, because if you negotiate a uniform carbon tax for the world, you know that that carbon tax applies not only to you, but to all your neighboring countries, all your trade partners. And that makes you more relaxed already, because it means that the level playing field is maintained. Your exports are getting more expensive maybe, but those of the neighbor too. And you could start the negotiations even in a very abstract way with letting first countries accept the carbon price, but keeping it zero at the zero level, and then negotiate slowly increases of the carbon price. When you get sufficient support, you can continue. If there is certain resistance, and it comes especially from poor countries, then you could say, okay, but we have now a carbon price of this level, positive level, we have revenues associated with that, we can use part of the revenues to compensate you. The alternative is to say, okay, in poor countries we can have a lower carbon price. But the danger of it is that then you have carbon leakage. Then you get carbon leakage. Same in countries. I've seen it in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands we also discussed, no, we should have a lower carbon price for the export sectors. Yeah, but that's not a good idea. What you should do is an equal carbon price, and then maybe a financial compensation for the export sectors if you feel they need support. But keep the carbon price uniform, because the price incentive should be the same throughout the economy. And of course, some countries will resist. They will never be on board in such a negotiation, especially the fossil fuel exporters. Saudi Arabia, Russia, they will not go along with it. They are notable for resisting any far-reaching steps in climate negotiations in the past. So you will never reach an agreement with all countries. And therefore, I also think we should not be idealistic. Trying to get Paris with all the countries in it more ambitious is a dead end. That's not going to work, in my view. It's just not going to work. So I foresee that we need a transition path, and we need to work at that UN level, the COP meetings. But we should also think of a coalition of countries that's more ambitious and is willing to implement a joint carbon price, and that they can protect that carbon price with a border tariff and then slowly grow over time. And they can, with one voice, speak at COP meetings and press there also negotiations for a carbon price. This is one model to work along. And here is an elaboration of how this could work in detail. So there are different phases that you can imagine. So the one track is a coalition or a club of countries with a joint carbon price. And the other track is the continued negotiations, the post-Paris negotiations. And yeah, here you get an initial coalition is the important decision. Which countries will be able in the beginning to work together on this? Can they expand through moral and economic pressure on countries outside the coalition? The moral pressure is by talking politically about it, by showing that they're really doing more than other countries. And the economic pressure would work through a border tariff. So they could put a border tariff for all the imports that come from countries that don't have a serious climate policy. And that then puts pressure on other countries. They will say, well, maybe it's better to be part of that coalition. Morally, we're better, and economically, it's not so bad either. And over time, the carbon price could rise, the border tariff could rise with it, a larger coalition, maybe there's a critical mass at some point, and then for many other countries it will become interesting to also join. And at the same time, they could put pressure on the UNFCCC negotiations. And maybe, through this interaction, where here are some details mentioned, so the coalition could speak with one voice at the UN meetings. The coalition could lobby for focusing on a carbon price at COP meetings. Lessons learned in the coalition about design and coordination of carbon prices could be transferred to the UN negotiations. And then a larger coalition could create critical mass in the UN process. So it's about building up slowly a critical mass. And then finally there would be a kind of integration where all countries would be part of the carbon price. That's very idealistic, that last step, but at least there is a path towards it. And then an important initial choice is, of course, which countries can be part of such a coalition. And with a student, I calculated for the biggest emitters which ones, so for the countries with most emissions, which ones would be most likely. And we see here a list, and there are countries that politically are not always stable. Australia, Canada, so Brazil. The thing is, we have made these calculations before the last elections, so these things change. But what is interesting is we formed our calculations on the basis of opinion surveys, the NDCs, and the participation in coalitions internationally or interregionally already. We put China here too because we feel China has a different position, and China is a centralized economy and could also participate. China also has a lot of coal benefits because China has very polluted cities. So in China there's another reason to go very advanced into emissions reduction. And if you would have China in, then you would have already 55% of emissions. So it's already more than half. Now, there is one country that you would like to have in, but that's impossible as it looks for the moment. We had during lunch a lot of discussion, and you reinforced my feeling that that's not going to happen. But what we thought of, we might think of a multi-level carbon pricing club. And then without the US being part of it, some states of the US, a resistant country, could be part of it. So we calculated which states could be most likely part of it, and it's again using the same method, not exactly the same data, because different data were available, but the same method and the same types of indicators. And then we arrive at some 30-35%, if I remember, and then we went one step further. We looked also how sensitive US states would be to pressure of international trade, because if the carbon pricing club would have a carbon tariff, and states in the US would export to those to the carbon pricing club countries, then they would be sensitive to that. So we looked at 4 important trading partners for the states. These are the EU, Canada, Mexico and China. Canada and Mexico evidently because they're neighbors, but the EU and China are also very important exporters or exporting countries for many states. And then we could identify countries that are very sensitive. And then we arrive at 70% of emissions of the USA could also be inside this coalition. So that's promising. If you add that, out of my head, we're still doing these last calculations, then maybe we could arrive even at 65-70% of global emissions already. That's very ambitious maybe, but it gives the indication that something is possible. you have to start a process among all these states and countries to see if something can happen. So that would be our next article, to try to write a more accessible article in a newspaper directed at all these countries, you know. Well, I'm arriving at my conclusions. So I think that carbon pricing is more subtle than many commentators realize, and I've tried to show you the subtleties of it. And I think what is important to realize is that it can be nationally and globally equitable if well designed through revenue recycling. This was always a serious concern, and it's understandable. And anyone who's now writing about carbon pricing will immediately talk about revenue recycling, because it's realized that otherwise you cannot get support. And in fact, the resistance in France to a carbon price recently was because of inequitable effects. It was maybe not so much income distribution, but it was people living in the countryside who were more dependent on cars maybe than people living in cities. So those are divisions that we have to take care of. We have to take that into account. That was the France proposal was bad even in another way, because at the same time of introducing a carbon price, they cancelled a wealth tax, an existing wealth tax. So that's the opposite of what they should have done. They should have said the revenues of this carbon tax will be used to compensate poor households. No, they did the opposite. They cancelled a wealth tax. That was the worst proposal you could imagine. It's very strange that that was ever designed, but it's a lesson for everyone, because everybody knows now about the yellow jackets resistance. So we make a lot of jokes about that, but it's something serious, of course. What is less understood is that carbon pricing, notably a carbon tax, is arguably the only instrument to globally harmonize and upscale climate policy. I cannot see how you globally harmonize and upscale standards. It's not going to happen. Subsidies even less, and subsidies have the disadvantage that they reward the clean alternative. They don't punish the high carbon option, so that's not a good instrument anyway. So I defy anybody to come up with a better solution here. And I think many people haven't thought that through. We don't talk so much about harmonization and upscaling policies. All the discussion, also in the newspapers, but also in science, is a lot about national unilateral solutions. But that's not going to do it. That's for sure. So I would hope that social scientists, and also natural scientists, but especially social scientists, would embrace and give explicit support to carbon pricing, because we need a critical mass of advisors also. And so far as I would guess that natural scientists are more inclined maybe to give support. Among social scientists there's a lot of diversity. You find a lot of non-economists that give support to carbon pricing, but you also find a lot of people who are skeptical or critical even. And finally, as I said at the beginning of my lecture already, I think it's very difficult to arrive at effective global climate policy. I'm extremely pessimistic. And therefore we have to think along these lines, combining political feasibility and what we know about good instruments and effective instruments. And I think what I've presented is feasible. There is a two-track transition with multiple levels. It is possible, but it's not easy. Well, this is my story for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Many thanks for the very interesting talk, Jeroen. Right.
Very good, very well.
Okay, so if there is any talk, maybe I can start with one. And I suppose the one concerning thing that I found was the point you had, the sort of giveaway point that carbon pricing in fact may not work for some areas, and then deforestation was one. And I thought, well, that's really worrying for us, because we all are scientists working on the natural resources, and deforestation, especially in the tropics, is a major concern. So what would you do there in that case?
That's a difficult one. I read an interesting tweet in reaction to that. People said we should have a moratorium on fossil fuels as of tomorrow. And he said, you think that's the solution? If that happens, then people will cut all the forests because they need fuel wood for heating and for cooking. So the thing is, we need a slow transition away. But that doesn't answer your question. I don't know. If we, forest is a different issue. We talk about deforestation to some extent, and that's related to agriculture. I'm not a specialist there, but if you have fossil fuels, maybe some kind of agriculture would become less attractive. Meat-based agriculture, which is part of the activity that's stimulating deforestation in South America, for instance, in Brazil. And maybe that would be discouraged through a carbon price indirectly. But I think it's better to rely on direct policies. I would never say that carbon pricing is going to solve that problem seriously, but it might contribute in a subtle way to making agriculture less profitable, and meat-based agriculture less profitable.
What about schemes like the one that Norway has, paid in money from their petrol industry funds to preserve Brazilian rainforests and things like that?
But can you stimulate that through policies? Can you stimulate other countries to do the same? That's difficult. These are voluntary choices by the country, and if there's political support for that in Norway, yeah, then that's nice. But I don't know if that's a model that can be applied easily to other countries. So I would like to think then in terms of what policies can we stimulate that might reach a good effect. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, if you start with this carbon tax club, and it's not, I'm sure what you said, if it's not like global immediately, which is impossible almost, then you also need kind of like accompanying policies for these indirect effects, no? Because otherwise, because if you only, like you said, the carbon tax, and then maybe the border tax, what you want to call that. But if you only do that, you don't have policies against these indirect effects, you have the carbon leakage and so on.
Yeah, no, if you don't cover the whole world immediately, then you have effectively a situation where one...
But then the club also need to commit to take actions against these indirect effects. No, it's not enough to only say that we do the carbon tax in the border.
Well, I would say, no, I see your point. It's a good point. It's absolutely a good point. I would say, first of all, the carbon border taxes are a rough way to compensate that, but we won't compensate completely.
Yeah, because it's also, you said, a border tax in the sense of things coming in and also things going. Yeah.
But you should see the carbon pricing club as a transition mechanism, not as a solution that is effective in solving all the problems.
Yeah, if your carbon club is not proving right, you will not go towards the global.
You mean it will be difficult to sell it as a good solution to other countries in that case?
If these indirect effects are still problematic, then it's not kind of example for other countries to join.
Yeah, but if, for instance, take the oil market responses. It might be that then oil markets are going to lower their prices for some countries, but not for others. But then there will be opportunities for countries to buy indirectly. So I think oil markets will have a difficult problem to face that. So there, I think even the green paradox will already be solved. The rebound effect will automatically be reduced because there will be consistent high price. So rebound, for instance, if you save energy, and you save also money, you spend that money on something else. And if there is a carbon price on all the goods and services in the economy, indirectly, then you will be discouraged to go to high carbon alternatives. And therefore a rebound will be limited too. So I think that will also work. And the carbon leakage will be limited, not completely undone, through the border tariff. So I'm quite positive. But the most important thing is that that's not the best instrument, and that you can also explain it's just a transition mode. So you want to go to the carbon price will always work better if all sectors and all countries are covered. That's true. So you're right in that sense. Yeah.
David?
Based on your figure up there, China and the United States combined for 45% of greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
They're currently engaged in a tariff war that's dragging everyone else down. If you can't get those two countries on board, then how can you have an efficient carbon pricing system?
No, I agree completely. And that's why we did the calculation of the US. And that's why I argued that China is not in the highest ranks. It's also not the lowest, but China is a special country. China is an outlier in many ways. It's not it doesn't have a completely market economic system, but it has a mixture, and the central governance is something good for sustainability and climate policy. That's also an advantage. So, and I think also in China there is awareness of that. China, in a way, is a free rider in the normal world, but China is such a big emitter that it also can become more conscious that it's biting in its own tail. It's doing itself damage through its emissions, more than small countries, because small countries can say, the Netherlands, we always say, is a 1% country in many dimensions. So, okay, we contribute only 1%. So 99% of the climate damages that we receive is by other countries. But in China's case, 30% is its own fault, and that's more significant. So that might mean that China is maybe a little bit more motivated than other countries. But this is all, I'm not optimistic, but I agree completely that China should be in it, but I think it would be absolutely very tactical to get US states in it. And that could even, in the US, also create like a domino effect and a critical mass effect. And it would show also to the world that the US is divided on the issue. So I think it would be interesting. That my hope would be, and I've written it in a Dutch newspaper and in Dutch magazines, that the Netherlands should take the lead, but any country could take the lead, start a carbon pricing club. Or the EU could do it, but the EU is also divided. So probably a country is a better starting point than the EU. Because the EU is also very slow and you know?
And disintegrated.
Disintegrated now at this moment with Brexit even, so yeah. It's also not, yeah.
I think it's oversold, this idea that it's disintegrated, at least outside of the EU. Well, any more questions? I have a final one, if I may. So you gave a lot of examples of, you showed a map where carbon pricing attempts were made, and effectively you highlighted examples of where it didn't work. And you also showed the example of France, where also they didn't do it properly. So who has done it properly so far?
Well, people would say British Columbia, that's a famous example. But that's of course a very small region. Many people refer also to Sweden having arguably the highest carbon tax, but it's immediately a carbon tax that has exemptions for export sector. So it's not really a carbon tax, that's the problem. So there's always a failure, and that's not, I wouldn't criticize the governments, I understand that. In the Netherlands, for instance, we want a carbon tax, and I fought with many economists. We wrote articles with 70 authors to give support to it. And the government went in the direction, and then they want to do it differently. We said, no, don't do it like this. And they didn't follow our advice. And finally, they have defined thresholds, and below the threshold, if you emit below the threshold, you don't pay, and above it, you pay. But that's not a carbon tax, that's a fine. And if the threshold is already defined, then you don't decentralize the policy. So that's a completely wrong way of doing it. It hurts me. In the Netherlands, there's enough knowledge to do it well, and they didn't do it well. And well, that's also because we had a dominant right-wing party in the government, and they don't want it. But they have so much pressure that that it was felt some carbon price should be implemented, because many countries have done it now. Germany recently also did something. I don't know, how would you classify the one in Germany, Stefan? Is it a real carbon price?
Jeroen and I always have discussions, what is a real carbon price? Because for him, real is what was written in the textbook, and then there's for me the real world carbon tax.
Yeah, okay, the real.
It's always imperfect. Yeah. But
in Germany?
The German case, there's a very low carbon tax that will be introduced.
Right.
So all the countries do it differently. That's worrisome also, but that shows that we have to move to a different model. We have to, and another way to start might be that some countries that are important trading partners of each other start a club, because then the trade is already protected partly, and that normally those are countries that have borders. Most, especially small countries, trade a lot with the surrounding countries. So, yeah. I'm going to think more about this, because this I see as the only way to move forward. This unilateral path that has been followed with all good intentions is not going to work. And if it works, some very left-wing parties want that their own countries do much more. But if that would be done, that would hurt the economy, and it would just mean the emissions go somewhere else. So all the good intentions would not become true. And so, with all good intentions, I cannot support. So I'm disagreeing with right-wing and left-wing parties, actually. That's also interesting, but it means we need to think through these things much better. And I think countries should much better realize they're not going to solve this issue without policy harmonization. And the Paris Agreement didn't achieve that. Paris Agreement was the best possible at the moment, and when they negotiated Paris, I think they had clear, after failures in Copenhagen, we have to come out of this meeting with an agreement. It was so clear for everybody. It doesn't matter how it is, whatever it is, we call it an agreement. And finally, they had a very weak approach, which hardly deserves the word agreement. So I can be positive about it because it's kind of a recognition that climate change is a serious problem, but it's not much more than that.
Very good. I think we leave it at this. Many thanks for your interesting, very stimulating talk, Jeroen.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.